things happen. So, and what is important about these gangs, both of them, is, for me, those shifts. How do they move from being defenders of society at one point to terrorizing society? And the other from just being concerned with crime and now involved heavily with politics, but still unleashing terror. So the last bit is a reconsideration of colonial delinquency. I think we can all understand I'm dealing with crime under the colony and the type of law that is not consent, or which is not the social contract. So what does it mean for crime in the colony? I begin with Fanon. There's a quote in Fanon in the Wretched of the Earth that says, every colony tends to become a huge farmyard, where the only law is the law of the knife. Anything can be done for a loaf of bread or a miserable sheep. First, what Fanon gives us the framework within which to think through these acts, the acts of these gangs. How are we to understand them if we are to shift outside, sort of rationalism as a framework? The sum total, of course, of which we refer to as delinquency. These are taking place in the colony, or what Fanon refers to as a huge farmyard. Fanon's evocation of the farmyard is critical because it immediately makes us think of the plantation, which finds a very important place in how Mbembe theorizes necropower, the geopolitical space central to the production of subjects of colonial rule and subjugation. In the first chapter on violence, Fanon paints the geopolitical space produced by colonial power and its subjectivation, or we might say the interior substance it produces in people for how they think and relate with themselves. He says it is a spaceless place. We know that a world without spaciousness, men live on top of each other. This is a critical description for how we understand the soul of the people who live under these circumstances. Especially important is that it is starved. It is starved precisely because the settler's town, the town for which the native works and envies, is a well-fed town, an easygoing town. Its belly is full of good things, says Fanon. This makes the native live in permanent admiration of the settler. It makes the native's mode of being in relation to the settler, Fanon says, that of enviousness, the impermanent envy of the settler's town. Natives lust over this town. And the settler's town, it's a well-fed town, and so on and so forth. Fanon says, for a colonized man, in context of oppression, living does not mean embodying moral values or taking his place in the coherent and fruitful development of the world. To live means to keep existing. Every day is a victory. Not the result of work, but a victory felt as a triumph of life. Blacks do not therefore set out to take their place in the coherent and fruitful development of the world. They set out to survive, to eat. Their existence is reduced to that of animals whose thinking is limited to basic subsistence, food. Fanon says the only perspective is that of the belly. These are like direct quotes. Which is more and more sunken, which is certainly less and less demanding, but which is more, must be consented to all the same. Colonization reduces the natives to their bellies. They are not greedy, because the belly actually no longer even demands much, but it demands anyway, and it must be filled. This is the worst human reduction you can find, to be reduced to your belly. But remember that our concern is with delinquency within the native's town. And it is the next thing that Fanon does after describing colonial conditions of the native's town and how these reduce in light of the settler's town, a people whose permanent dream is possession, lasting, and envy. So to understand delinquency, the delinquency that we shall, to understand the delinquency that we shall call colonial begins with understanding that the colonized people is a people reduced to their bellies. For them to steal or to allow one sheep to eat another neighbor's grass is not a question of the negation of the property of the other, not the transgression of a law, nor lack of respect. These, Fanon says, are attempts at murder. This is because for Fanon, every day the sun rises is a native's victory over death, a triumph of life, a conquering of death. This is the proximity of the two forces. The line between living and dying is completely reduced to access to a plate of food, survival. When Fanon says to steal is an attempted murder, he means it is conquering starvation. And when you steal from another person, another starved person, you are attempting murder. You risk them dying instead of you. To steal from another person there, in that condition of general starvation, Fanon says that it's an attempt at murder. This is the punishment he speaks of when he says, who is going to take the punishment? Because the people that are oppressing us are surrounded by barricades and the police, and they promise all types of punishments. So who is going to take the punishment for our condition? This must be qualified in that by now it is obvious. Okay, so we must not think of the punishment question as relating to the breaking of a law, because there is no mutual legal existence that led to the native being in the colonial condition. The native suffered a terrible defeat, triumphed by the settler. The native is a defeated people, reduced to their bellies, so to speak. The language of the native's condition is precisely the language of law. They are a defeated people, not tricked. Not like given the Bible, they took the land. No, it's not a trick, they were defeated. Justice comes with this burden, the burden of being defeated. That is part of the people who are in liberation, is that it's also like, hey, we're defeated, we must reclaim a certain victory. Which means to ask who is going to take the punishment has to do with who is to blame for our defeat. So who else, if not ourselves? You can see Fanon is playing around, I think, with very interesting questions. So the answer that he gives, again, must be taken within that context. He says, as I said, the French, they are protected because it's the white people, let's say white people, they are protected by all types of the police and so on and so forth. Let me jump here. So who must take the punishments? He says you are forced to come up against yourself, meaning you must take the punishment. He says, here we discover that canon of self-hatred, of the hatred of self, which is characteristic of racial conflict in segregated societies. This canon lies in the difficulty of punishing the settler for the settler's injustice, who out of the sea arrived, launched an evil on the native so humiliating, so spectacular, so complete. The racial aspect is what makes colonial violence peculiar, even though it uses material conditions which may be available, say in the case of the camp. For blacks, they are in the camp, they are defeated because they are black, which puts the seal on them. They are naturally incapable of escaping. To highlight what we mean here, again we must use Fanon's expression. He says, each man formed a screen for his neighbor, and that in reality each man committed suicide when he went for his neighbor. Killing or stealing from the neighbor is about punishing them for your condition, the condition that you both share. It is in the end self-killing, not suicide. Criminality, colonial criminality, has to be violent, for it is an absolute response to death. It is dealing with death, servicing death as it were. Most critically, it is self-punishment executed on the blamed self, the lasting envious self. Okay. If indeed this is the sense with which delinquency, with which that we understand delinquency, it redirects punishment that should come to the settler back to the farmyard. If this is the case, how do we make sense of what we framed as the crossroads of crime and liberation through Mbuyiseni's corpse? One, the interesting about the question of crime we have been considering is to make sense of this path, liberation, violence, and crime, and vice versa. The Khetisi gang starts with crime, ends with killing liberation fighters, whereas the BZ gang starts with liberation, ends up with crime, including killing comrades. So the first conclusion we can draw, using Fanon's reading, is that what we notice is that the work of self-punishment finds everydayness in crime. It is with crime that the canon of self-hate that is expressed in massacres carried out by blacks on blacks, like in the case of Bipato, finds an element of everydayness. Colonial delinquency, like most of what others the colonial world, is violence, but it is that everydayness of the work of self-punishment, the type of violence only otherwise experienced, for instance, in intra-mass violence between natives according to tribes. It is a mirror screen to transfer the violence that should otherwise be directed at the settler. It is not a crime. It is a self-punishment for the colonial situation. This provides a reading of crime that does not abdicate the broader colonial order of things. Instead, it keeps it alive and kicking in the critique of what goes on with violent crime. This is the underlying logic of violent crime under colonial conditions. Self-hatred, Fanon says. And he suggests that to deal with crime here, and he suggests to deal with it in the last chapter, you would notice, in the Record of the Earth, as opposed to in the first. Why? Because in the first chapter, Fanon is dealing with that violence of tribes and xenophobic violence, which comes in outbursts in society. Even under apartheid, at some point, the township goes boom and blacks are killing each other. We say, 100 and something people died in Bipato because Ingata came. He leaves that because he wants to deal with a different form of crime, of violence, which is the everydayness, finds work. If black on black violence is the work of self-hatred, then in crime it finds everydayness, a normalcy of sort, where blacks go against each other, distribute death at any time, it is its everydayness with crime. That is what I argue is colonial delinquency. Okay, we jump this. How much time, Professor?
5 minutes.
Okay. So township crime, I'll maybe find ways of expanding on this when we take questions. So we asked what Mbuyiseni's corpse represents, and suggest that it represents an intersection of the work of crime and liberation. But the complete meaning of this intersection will be achieved when examining underground units of liberation, because there are two positions that the native has, the two directions that the native have. I'm proposing that this is the same subject position. They share a same subject position which has two options: the work of self-hatred, or what Fanon calls the work of love. And my chapter today, this one is about colonial delinquency and violent crime. It's about the self-hatred. So to the comrades and the criminals is the same subject position with two different pursuits. Others take, we must terrorize society, we must eat from it, and so on and so forth. Others do the work of self-love. Of love. That is what Fanon characterizes it as. So I'll stick to this one for now. The original act of liberation in the colony is always a double-headed figure that can turn on itself, or whose first option might be to turn on itself. We see this in the frontier gangs at first, particularly the powerful stories told by Nigel Pearl about the runaway slaves who come across a shepherd. They stab him in his face repeatedly, opening his stomach and disposing it of its insides and mutilating his body parts so that he could be thought to be attacked by a wild animal. This was their justification. Okay? But there's also conflicts of these gangs at the border there with the Khoi and the Xhosas, of these runaway slaves from the colony. Okay, so most importantly, what we see with the frontier is that in the frontier, to run away, which was conceived as well as freedom or liberation, required food. So why did they kill this pet and stab him like that? In the process of liberation, you know, running away, runaway slaves, they're liberating themselves, either going to Madagascar or going elsewhere. In the process, they have to survive. So are the gangs of the 1990s. What the justifications of the BZs for why they turned around is that part of liberating